pleasure to have you here. So, with the film, after going into television for a while, tell me a little bit about your process for sort of looking for inspiration for a story that would be cinematic instead of, as you mentioned, for opening for streaming. I'm going to turn these down just a little bit.
I never felt there was a difference between cinema and television. But the difference was more that the limitations in both areas were very singular. And after having done 2 shows, I kind of lost interest because the format was, again, a form of limitation, I felt. So I began to go into more fine arts with working with fashion brands, which was a more kind of freeing, because they had no, there was no commercial pressure. But then I died physically. I was dead for 25 minutes. And so when I came back, which I did, and I'm here, I came to the realization I'd been given a gift that I could start over again. And I figured I'd done something in my past, but it was more using the same medium, but for different reasons now. And to me, cinema was the only place that I felt was of social importance. Because if you want to see a movie, I mean, you can just go on your phone, there's a movie. If you want to be a television show, whatever, it's on your phone. But something in our human existence is the shared experience, which is diminishing because of the inequality globally and the digitalization of mass entertainment and so forth. Things that are very simple that we sometimes maybe don't nurture enough, which is this collective experience that makes us human. So it's not so much about seeing a movie, it's about being in a cinema together that I felt was in a way what it was all about now.
I feel like this film, maybe most of all of your films, requires kind of a physical giving over to the aesthetics that really demands the cinema. So talk a little bit, I guess, about the qualities. I mean, it's sort of pure cinema in that sense. There's so much about this that only exists through the means of telling a story that cinema can do. So give us a sense of how you applied that desire to make something this wholly cinematic, but having to start in presumably a screenplay form, and what that was going to look like.
Well, I shoot all my films in chronologically order, because otherwise I get confused. It's a problem if the director is confused. So I've always practiced that, because I like the act of not knowing. I mean, I'll know, obviously, because it's written down, but it's how I get there, and I know by the time I get there I'm going to change it. But then I know when I've gotten there that it was the right decision to get there. So a film like this, for me, was more an alchemy of many things. You know, I wasn't interested in one kind of movie, I wanted all kinds of movies. Because it reminded, I discovered cinema not in a cinema, but on television when I was 8 years old. I came to New York from Denmark, where television didn't really exist. And suddenly I had all these channels I could click. And it was like an instant dopamine of just images that would affect me. narrative was secondary because the experience was more overwhelming. And of course, once you go into a more commercial arena of traditional commercial format, there are rules and regulations. But those are also what have become sterile in our medium. And so when for this film, because I went and I got the money first before I even had a script, so I could do it in another direction. And then I had these two ideas that were very polar opposites, which was Private K going to hell and a young woman coming to a city that didn't exist. And then I had to figure out, okay, well, what's the story between these? And I was banging my head against the wall for a long time, but nothing was coming out. Until I came up with, well, if I could have like a monster, like a boogeyman, that would become the focal point of the triangle. And then suddenly within that, you could fill it up with emotions. And those emotions you could then use to build a narrative of many things, like flicking television set or scrolling on your phone, which I think is very interesting, how technology opens up new ways of understanding cinema.
I mean, I feel like there's a certain amount of this film that if I had watched it in a foreign language without subtitles, the aesthetic alone of the dialogue would have been equally compelling. So when you're actually committing to a script, what does that look like with a film that's so visually and orally sort of aesthetic, as opposed to dialogue driven?
Well, you just tell the same story in other ways. You know, narrative is many things. It's not just information. You know, information is easy because it informs and it's quick to digest. But you can say the same things in many different ways. And we sometimes kind of forget because we're so in tune with technology and speed of information. You know, having it delivered to us so fast so we can consume it even faster to move on to the next. But that's just going fast. That doesn't make it necessarily interesting. And this is not a critique of anything. It's just, I don't necessarily find that particularly interesting for the human soul to have this constant dopamine of empty calories.
Do you, I mean, it does feel like every frame is kind of its own piece of art. And I'm curious how much of that is found on set with your cinematographer and your production designer and your actors, as opposed to things that you're sort of bringing into it in the pre-production. Are you composing shots well in advance, or are you sort of finding it on the set?
I used to never work with storyboards because I was like, I have to be and I have to see and then I'll figure it out. And I've always made films in urban environments, regardless of the fairy tale storylines. They were also shot in cities. But because this film had to be fake in its DNA, I mean, the design had to be fake, and I didn't have a lot of dough and very limited time, I needed to draw the entire film out prior. That I would just hang up on a long wall at the production offices so the whole crew could know what we were making. I mean, we were shooting the film in Denmark, so, which is a little bit different than here. So with the actors, we were no more than 30 people total. So everyone could kind of gather around the wall to see what we were going to do that day. And then I would have references to either fashion or design or ideas that were like, what are we trying to find? What is the vibe?
What were the fashion references? Because between this and Niantimen, I find that such a fascinating world that you explore.
Well, I mean, fashion is a lot of fun to indulge in because it's all aesthetics and sensibilities. So anything that was glamorous is always very appealing.
And painful.
Of course, for the people to sit through and have to wear it.
So I'm curious a little bit about your casting. Sophie Thatcher is rapidly putting together quite a filmography. I'm curious what drew you to her, what qualities you were looking for in that character that she had.
So we were casting for a year. I think we saw 10,000 young girls, and there was not the one. And I've learned that not to try to find the one, but the one will show itself. It's almost like you go through a process of so many, limitations that whatever is left is the right choice. I think Sherlock Holmes said that or something. But she came in very late, and we were actually nearing production, and we still didn't have her, and I couldn't finish any other casting until I had her, because she was the foundation of the movie. So I was very fortunate that she suddenly came in by chance. And the minute I saw her, it was like, you're the one. Are you available?
Yeah.
And then I could then have the others who I liked, Havana and Christine had already been auditioning, but I didn't know how to place them yet until I had Sophie Thatcher. And then with Charles, it was a similar thing, because his iconography was very much in the family of, Mads Mikkelsen and Ryan Gosling. So he had to have a physique, a certain Greek god status. And it's hard to find these people. So I was watching. So I have 2 kids, and my youngest is the cinephile, and I think she was around 15 or something, and it's interesting because she used to be such adventurous with her movie choices, and then fucking Netflix came. And now it's more fighting for her not to watch these shows and go bang to. But I have this deal where I can, you see some of mine, I see some of yours. So we were gonna rush Riverdale, which happened to be an amazing thing. It's a fantastic show. I did show her Twin Peaks to explain where it all came from.
Yes. Matronymic.
Yes.
The through line with those two.
But so this season that we had to sit through was take place in the 50s, and Charles came, and he just looked so fucking good. And I was like, how do I get him out of this show and into my movie? And then I called him, and he was very kind and was willing to meet and stuff. And I asked if he was willing to work topless, and he was.
Well, so obviously, Twin Peaks is something that you care about. I am also a huge fan. In fact, Cheryl Lee teaches at an acting workshop here in this room a couple times a year. Yeah, which if any of you are here in the fall, we usually do like in November. Tell us. So one thing that I always found really fascinating about Lynch is, for as much as rich as his texts were, he would never tell you anything about them. Like he would never reveal anything as an artist. And the one thing I'm curious about is, how do you sort of work that same way, where you take things from your subconscious and sort of wrestle with them in a film? And if you're not as communicative as to sort of like what it all means, how do you work with other artists to make it happen?
Well, you could play a song or reference something completely different, and in a way explain it through other means. But you see, I don't have any skills. Like I was kicked out of acting school, as we were saying earlier. That's my contribution. That's my CV, And I have certain. Look, I got all the diagnoses in the book, and a lot of fucking nonsense. It's all government control. But anyway, my hand and my brain have difficulties communicating and stuff like. I'm very dyslexic and I am the poor little match girl. I'm also colorblind and so forth. But what I saw that I could do was I was enough of an exhibitionist to allow myself to, my own emotions to become the canvas. So I could turn myself into the product. And that became my craft. So a director, in a way, doesn't have to know anything because you have a technical team around you. But a director has to give you the emotions that narrates everything else around you. You know, that's the end of the core, and at the end of the day, you know, that's what a director is. And whether you have writers or non-writers or cinematographers or editors, they're all there to support the one notion of what is the emotional ability for the director to express what's inside of them, which is why film is such a seductive medium in many ways.
Of course, this film has an exceptional score. How much of that was something written after the film, written during the production, so that you're composing shots that might be accompanied by the music? I mean, that the relationship with your composer must be really interesting because it is an exceptional piece of sort of like almost contrapuntal to the image sometimes. And I'm curious if you're designing things knowing what the music is going to be, or if it all comes later.
Well, I used to work with a composer called Cliff Martinez, who is an amazing, obviously, pop star and composer. But this was the first movie I was making where I didn't really know what it was going to sound like, which was very new to me. Usually that's one thing I do know from the beginning. And I'd obviously worked with a lot of electronic, material over the years because I like electronic music. It's part of my youth, But here it was like I tried things that just wasn't working. The obvious tricks you would pull out of your bag. But I think it's because, in a way, I realized I wanted to make an opera. I mean, halfway shooting it, I'm standing in a room the size of this in Copenhagen, not as advanced as you guys, with like fake crystals around me, going, I guess it's an opera. Because everything is as fake as it possibly could be, was just plastic around, cheap plastic. So, but the themes in the film were very operatic. A young girl, father's always leaving. I mean, I don't know if there's anyone who's a parent here, but you're always leaving your kids, and you're always feeling guilty. This father happens to marry her lover, who becomes a stepmom, so that's very, melodramatic, camp sighting. So that's operatic. Elle's kind of imagination of her alter ego as a man, as the perfect father, the father that we as parents always inspire to be, but will never essentially become. There's something like a subculture called dadsploitation, which I always found very interesting, which is a form of cinema that allows men to, act extremely violent for the sake of protecting innocence. And it's a very male thing. It's something that bonds us. It's like male porn that is purely male-driven. And that's exploitation. Look it up. And
it's like every Liam Neeson movie.
He's a king. He's like the John Holmes of that exploitation. But there was something in that again was operatic, because it was imagination. It was fantasy. And so, okay, an opera. And I'm not a big stage person. I wish I was, but I'm not as sophisticated. I just love movies. So an opera on film, I'm in. And so if you want to make an opera, you have to find a composer that knows opera music and film music. So you go to Italy. That's where the greats are from. The problem is all those composers that we would all probably reference, they're all dead. Except Pino Donaggio. I had to Google him, but he was in his mid-80s, had kind of gone into retirement, was living in Venice. But his music is obviously iconic, and I'm sure a lot of us could find films that he would reference. You know, all his work with Brian De Palma, or working with Dario Argento and other, greats that are very musically driven in their films. You know, a lot of those movies we remember sometimes the music more than we remember the plots. So Pino was like, he didn't speak a word of English, but very Italian, slick back hair, big sunglasses. But he was in. I said, okay, but you're gonna die soon because you're in the mid-80s most likely. So let's make it into a requiem. And he was like, he found that funny, so we could kind of talk. You have to break the ice. And but what I'd done was I'd reversion to near it, I'd gamble. So see, I like to gamble, meaning that when you create, you got to create with no safety net. There's a great line and shot in Once Upon a Time in the West, where Henry Fonda shoots this guy who's like an informer for the bandits. And he says, don't trust a guy who wears a belt and suspenders. Because creativity is about being unsafe. It's about going in and having one chip and you gamble on it. Because you gotta make it work. There's no option, there's no alternative. Because you gotta be that willing to make it work. So I said to him, and he knew better than me, opera, you make the music first. Now we're gonna do the opposite. I make the film, I lock myself in. It's practically locked editorially. I build the veins, there's hot, but there's no blood. Your music is going to tie this entire movie together. If your music doesn't work, this film falls apart. It's going to be that simple. So, I think it worked. Yeah, that was the gamble.
Since you brought up Dario Argento, I was thinking about his use of color, Suspiria, but also his sort of interplay of sort of dream logic. I mean, I've seen Inferno many times and have no idea what happens in the film, but I love the physical act of watching it, letting it sort of take over. I also noticed that you were working on a remake of What Have They Done to Solange? If that's to be
don't believe what the internet
okay.
always writes.
But this does sort of
That's a great
point
movie.
you towards Italian films in the 70s and 80s. And I'm curious a little bit about your interest in that, because those films operated to some extent on, maybe not Argento, but on a certain sort of lack of general filmmaking coherence. But you're not a C-list filmmaker. You're one of the great artists of film right now. Looking back at some of these movies that I think time has kind of shown had some great aesthetic qualities in particular, what's your interest in that sort of material?
Well, I think that obviously Dario Argento is an enormous kind of inspiration to most filmmakers, maybe even subconsciously, because of his contribution to ways that film is being made and viewed. You could say the three great Italians, in my opinion, are him and Antonioni and Sergio Leone. I mean, those are the ones that will continue to, with every generation, to be rediscovered and re-examined, in my opinion, And what it is, because they're all architects, really. They define certain aesthetics obviously the storylines are as crazy as Dario Argento, or as classical as Sergio Leone, or existentially almost sci-fi-ish as Antonioni, but they're all architects. They're designers, essentially. They penetrate the mind that surpasses not just information, but experiences. And I think that's why we keep on revisiting them and teach them and show that if you want to pursue filmmaking, this is what you have to aspire to, because there is something that worked. Now, Inferno, which I also think is probably my personal favorite Dario movie, but I also know that Dario was living off cocaine for like 10 years, which is Suspiria and Inferno. You know, it's the ultimate cocaine movies, because he just like, fuck it, you know. It was a great idea on, you know.
So tell us a little bit about once you've shot the film. I mean, you're saying that you have to do it chronologically because you're discovering things and you wouldn't remember. Does that give a roadmap to the editor that makes it a pretty easy collaboration? Or is the fact that this is a lot of sort of like in and out of dream logic, does that make it harder for your editor to kind of capture your vision?
So there are people that have, when you collaborate, that certain, you know, partners that go through your entire career are very important, you know. And for me, the only crew member that comes with me on everything I make is editor Matt Newman. He's a British guy who lives in Germany. And we started on, his first film was Bronson with me. And has then have gone on to be part of everything I've made ever since. And I show him, he's the guy I show the ideas to, or talk about what I'm kind of thinking about, and then we looking at analytically and from like script stages and discuss it, and he comes on set and is part of, you know, edits while I'm shooting, and so he's very involved. And because I'm colorblind, he helps me into post also, because so you see, I can feel color, but I can't necessarily see it. So he can help, knowing my situation, to explain to the colorist what they sometimes have to do in post, because a lot of the coloring is in post, because on set it's hard for me to fully comprehend. I just say I want a lot of color and no green, because I'm not going to be able to see it. So there are certain things they can't use.
That's an absolutely fascinating thing to hear from someone who does use so much color. If you don't mind sharing a little bit about that, what does resonate with you in terms of color? So you don't use green, but there's a lot of like fuchsia and blues and things like that. How does that?
Well, I like those I can see. They speak. I like them very much. But there's a lot of mid colors that I know that I can feel, but I don't know how to explain them. So somebody has to sit and make it, and I'll say, I like that. And then they'll say, yeah, but that's wrong. I said, so? That's how I like it, so we're going to do it like that. You kind of create your own color palette.
Yeah, fascinating. Tell us a little bit, if you don't mind, about being a filmmaker who makes films that are very much a cinematic experience, knowing that we're now in a world where so many people watch entertainment, film, art on devices that are completely antithetical to the kind of films you make.
Well, I'm not so against anything, because I think that what you really need to look at more is like what you make has to work on a cell phone or in a place like this. One doesn't justify the other one not existing. Everything is equally as interesting. I mean, I watch things on my phone, but I also watch things in here. But so the film is not the purpose for me anymore. It's what the experience means. It's my conscious decision of going out, buying a ticket, going into a movie theater and sitting down. Because time has a different meaning to me now that I know I only have X amount of years left of my life. So I'm very protective of my time. But aesthetically, I love all devices. You know, I love television, you know. One of the things, flat screens are sexy, but they're wonderful to look at, but I love those old analog machines, you know, they're very curvy. I love that, I love objects, you know. But I don't think there's a right or wrong way, it's just because it's what are you in the mood for, where are you, why not? And maybe it is a form of intimacy looking like this compared to looking at something grand.
I want to just ask one last thing, but I want to kick it over to the students. Could you talk a little bit about the conceptual design for the city? Because, I mean, it's something I haven't seen before. I was very much drawn into it from the very first shot. But then coupled with the concept of the mist and sort of, you know, how that plays into their status and eventually it's sort of accompanying Leatherman in the end. It's a very bold design, and you've talked a few times now about having a limited budget, so obviously needing to have a certain amount of art created for this. I guess just tell us a little bit about, you know, how you came to it and how you actually constructed it.
Well, I wanted everything to feel analog, so everything had to be built with paint and wood, and then I couldn't afford LEDs, so there was just old school green screen that I would then comp in afterwards. No AI, just old school CGI. And then it was the limitations. I could build the apartment that they were living in and 2 rooms that I would swap in between. And we did go to one location for the fight sequences with the big fat Yakuza man, but everything else we had to build and it wasn't even, because we don't really have studios in Denmark, it was more like a warehouse, so the sound was terrible. And then I could build a very small area that was very much like a fantasy Tokyo, that had basically one square where you could walk around like this. And it was the size of this room. So everything was cheating images and a lot of smoke to diffuse the wall that was right ahead of you and stuff like that. So, but again, budgets are never a reason why not to succeed. If anybody says I didn't have enough money, they're not an artist. You know, because money is great, and as much as you have it, even better. But remember, with every dollar you get, there's a collect. And if you want to be completely free and do whatever the fuck you want, you got to make it very inexpensive, because that is how you buy your freedom. You don't buy your freedom from the audience, you buy your freedom from the financial partners, because by the end of the day, as long as people don't lose money, you're free. And an artist's obligation is to be free and create purely from the heart. So even though we had little dough, to me, I was like making Star Wars.
Does anyone want to jump in? Yeah.
So I wanted to ask a question about, you mentioned like feeling color, but I want to know kind of like how that's evolved since like student film days, Pusher, Bleeder, stuff like that, kind of like how that's like your journey with feeling color.
Well, I never went to film school, so I don't have any, you get more aware of it. I didn't know it was colorblind until I was 24.
Hey, I'm curious about like how you use gore in your films, because I feel like there's always so much extreme gore, but you're so like nonchalant about it, you know? I'm just curious, like, what's your relationship with gore and what's the significance of it to you?
Well, I love brutality, and I love extremeness, and gore is amazing. I have what's called a leaking heart, which means that your blood runs backwards suddenly. And I had to have a heart operation. But I was able to get a very sophisticated one through my side, and I didn't have to have open heart surgery. So they went through my body and into my heart and sliced it open and fixed my valve, which was loose, and then sewed it up. And I have it all on video. So I know what I look like on the inside, and it's fantastic.
Yes.
First of all, fantastic that you're here. I'm an alum, actually, of the film school, so I was here a number of years ago before a lot of this was here. So it was very analog back then, everything on film and old school. So Drive is one of my favorite films of the last 15 years. So incredible, many things. But that seemed like it was a bit more of a traditional narrative. And then your work since Drive has kind of moved a little bit more experimental. I'm just curious, because I'm sure you've had opportunities as well to do Hollywood films and this and that. I'm curious why you have chosen not to kind of stay within that more traditional narrative and versus kind of going the direction you've gone.
Well, because when you've done it once, why do it again? You see, I had a lot of great meetings in Hollywood, but essentially it's like making very big commercials, which I do once in a while, and I enjoy them very much. But for me to create, in terms of where I feel satisfied, I need to come to work every day with complete freedom. And that compromise, I'm not the right person to work in a place that obviously is so driven by commerce. And look, don't get me wrong, I love money. I mean, I have a very expensive lifestyle. But I'll find other ways to compensate for that, because creatively, I think it's more exciting to go to places that I haven't gone to and continue to push the barriers. Because even now, when you say that Drive had a more classical narrative, when the film first came out, it was what everything was criticizing of not having a classical narrative. But then people forget and time kicks in and you suddenly see it from a more classic perspective. Suddenly it all feels, but Drive's the same way. It's just a lot of people looking at each other. And then some violence and some music. It's pretty experimental. It takes a long time before nothing happens and so forth. But everything for me, I'm not an example of anything here, but for me, the pleasure of creativity outweighs whatever they can give you. So if you can stay at home or in your known environment and do exactly what you want to do and be free, nothing's ever going to beat that. Everything else you see around you is just pomp and pretend. It's an act. But you live in the process of creativity. That's when you're alive. The product is just dead space. It's for the audience. It's for everyone else but you. So I've always just wanted to do my own thing, my own way. And obviously that comes with a cost. At the same time, says who?
So when you talk about like the whole deathplication thing and like how it gives like these male characters like a reason for them to be violent, like rightfully so. It kind of like brought me back to this made me think about fighting games and like Nicolas. I just wondered like how, because you mentioned how like gore for you is like an important thing like personally, and I wonder just like how do you approach it from that like morality, like how do you use the gore and the violence as like a way to like tackle that?
I don't.
Okay.
I just make what I want to see.
I think like my favorite thing about your filmography is it kind of feels like each of your movies has kind of a catharsis of like hyper-masculinity, hyper-femininity, and like it almost feels like a frustration of gender roles, even though like everything's kind of put at the forefront. I'd love to hear about like your relationship to gender and like especially coming into this movie, like what your mindset was with that kind of thing.
Well, I've always been very interested in gender neutrality and a more fluidity between masculine and feminine, but not in a physical form so much. I like to fetishize objects and people, like dolls. It turns me on to be able to photograph things like body parts. And I think that masculine and feminine, like the more masculine you are, the more feminine you are, and vice versa. And the more you can lean into those almost stereotypes, the more hyper-realism kicks in. Because, see, what's interesting about fairy tales, which is something that I used to make films about reality, or capture authenticity. And I realized that I could never really succeed, like it would never get real enough. When I made my first film, I was very lucky. I was 24, I was arrogant as a motherfucker, and everything had to be real. You know, the drugs were real, the gangsters were real, the violence got real. Like everything had to be real because that was the objective. And obviously, like any band, once you realize it doesn't really work like that, I couldn't really exist for a very long time in it, so I got interested in unreality. And unreality has much more of a canvas of possibilities. So if you look at the fairy tales, which essentially is what I make, if you want to categorize me, it's like if you take a piece of paper and hold it like this, it has lines of information. That's modern, that's commercial entertainment. It's informed, it's like codes. But fairy tales, if you turn to paper, it's paper thin, with a very simple narrative, like almost like over simplistic, to the point where it becomes banal, or you would think. But then when you turn it, suddenly that banality becomes an endless amount of, interpretations. So suddenly something so simple as boy meets girl, or girl meets boy, and they live happily ever after, has a enormous amount of interpretations. And their sexuality and gender becomes something we now revisit again and again and again in the next 10,000 years. And that is something I find interesting.
So are you trying to kind of like live between here and here, or like bounce between all these things? Like,
I know that I like to live in the thinness.
look at you.
You said that shooting body parts turns you on, and I think you shoot hands in a very beautiful and sexy way, so I'm wondering what turns you on about hands.
So, I have the softest hands in the world. You can feel them if you want.
I would love to feel your hands.
I will show you my hands. So when I was little, I was obsessed with hands, and I forced my mother to rub Vaseline on my hands and put socks on them. So when I woke up, they were as an infant. And I've used hands through most of my films as an object. And I think it has to do with this sense of touch, like this very gentle, that how your body reacts to something as simple as touching something and touching another human. And the softer your hands are and the more refined and beautiful and aesthetic the stronger the touch. And there is something that's very human in just touching each other.
Yeah, so something I find fascinating, especially since your work has become so dreamlike, is you funded a restoration for one of the great neo-realist films of American cinema, Spring Night, Summer Night. Where does that kind of fascination with that type of taboo sexuality or kind of realism that I think is kind of, it's in the work, it's even in Private Hell, where does that kind of work in tandem with the grotesque?
Right, so Spring Night, Summer Night, I don't know if anyone's seen this. It's an amazing film. It was a lost movie that was gonna go on and kind of change American cinema back in the 60s, but just got forgotten. And through an archivist who works for me, I got hold of the negative and bought the rights and restored the film. It's an absolute masterpiece. And it showed what was happening in the French New Wave was actually happening in rural America. But in a way much more sincere, in my opinion, because it wasn't political cinema. So I highly recommend it. But it has a kind of perverse story between a brother, sister who you don't really know if there is a relationship or not, or are they brothers and sisters. I like perversion, like anyone else. A great soap opera is all about how much and how the enormous of perversion that you can go through and what people do to each other, because it's heightened reality. It's entertainment, It's like I love gossip.
Hi, first, thank you for being here. This is really cool. A lot of us in the room right now are still working in short form. And so, the day that we leave these walls and we go on to make our first feature, but, take you back to the Pusher days. What are some mistakes you made that really stuck with you, and how did you prepare yourself for that transition?
So, you have to be able to fail once, like miserably fail, like suicidal fail. Because otherwise you're not going to feel what real success is like. And I know it's a cliche, but trust me, I thought it was a cliche, but it's true. And my big mistake was wanting to belong, wanting to be accepted, wanting to be part of the establishment, wanting to be, nominated. And I did everything that I wasn't supposed to do because I wasn't being myself. So when I was 24, I was very lucky with a blank CV of being kicked out of acting school to con the government to give me $800,000 to make Pusher. Now, later on, I was like, well, now I gotta make the movie that's like, so I can get into the club, my membership card. And God said, I'll let you do it, but I'm gonna totally destroy you. And I could only rise after that because I owed my bank $1 million. And I had to pay that. In order to pay that, I could make Pusher 2 and 3 to pay off my debt. And then I knew never to do that again. And I became interested in unreality, because that was where I belonged. But I took those diverse chances. So whatever you want to do, don't try to belong to a club. Don't join the establishment. Make films that you want to make exactly how you want to make them. Because that is the one thing that can never be taken away from you. They can criticize you, they can call your movie bad or good, like who the fuck cares? They can never take anything away from you that's made with your heart.
What kind of notes did you find yourself giving the most on set? How did you communicate with your actors?
Relax. Stand still. Perfect. perfect. One more time. Let's do it again. You kind of get into that mode. I like stillness and silence at the moment. Probably next year I won't, but I still do now, because stillness and silence is the most provocative thing you can make in commercial entertainment. Because we're so used to shiny objects flying around or noise. Some of the streamers even invented this thing where you can speed up the shows by 10-20% so it can go faster. Any religion or faith has some foundation that are equal amongst them all, which is stillness and silence. When you have kids and you're going to be a good parent, you try to shield them from all this noise so they can concentrate and they can learn to be still and they can be engaged. And little Billy plays with Lego for 2 hours because he's a genius or whatever. That is essentially the evolving of the human sense. That's the soul that's evolving. But why does entertainment have to make that an enemy? On the contrary, we should embrace it. But so something as so simple as faith now is the enemy of the system. And I find that exhilarating because it's exciting. It's like when people, we were talking about Drive, a lot of the critique was, why are they just looking at each other? Like, why they're not, even the people on, the actors like, shouldn't I say things? No, it's fine to just stand right there. Don't worry about it. But they were falling in love. Carrie and Ryan, you got to show that simplicity. And so those are the things that I like. And then obviously, a director has to become a best friend, a therapist, an emotional, non-physical lover, and a military general. And then all that, not in that order necessarily, but that's all those devices you're going to be able to handle when you're working with actors.
There's something that, speaking of like stillness and silence, I've seen a few times in your works, like in Jewel, Without Young, and in Young Demon. Not on this film where it's like a club or like a bar or something, but it's just like the main characters and like everything in the background is like frozen, and like you had like the statues in this film. I'm curious, like, one, I think it's a super cool creative choice. I'm sure it also helps with like budget and financial constraints. So where did that come from, or what inspired that?
Well, I didn't have the money, so I couldn't hire extras more than 5. And then notoriously, I hate club scenes. So I thought it could be interesting, but I had these statues instead, so I thought that was more aesthetically interesting. But that's just like a personal thing.
Any final question?
Perhaps it's merely the aesthetic of the dream world. It seems that Private K was existing within, but I was really fascinated by your choice of giving Porsche 911s to the Japanese police. How did that come to you?
It was around in the prop department. And it looked really good on camera.
It did.
But they would actually use those cars back then. So authentically wise, all the research that I did was very much like, I brought on a Japanese writer, Takuma. He produced a movie called Perfect Days that he also wrote the script for. It's a fantastic movie. But he was like my Japanese go-to guy whenever I had to ask. And the funny thing is, he would just Google things.
Just one last quick one. Who were your inspirations?
Mine?
Yes.
I didn't. Okay, so this is so obviously I love cinema, and that's, and I've stolen from anyone, just like everyone. Everyone steals. The ones who don't are lying. So we all steal. So all this thing about I invented this, whatever. You saw it somewhere and then you stole it and you made it into your own, which is completely normal. Every painter stole, Picasso stole, left, right, and center. To steal from the best. But I think in my situation, more specifically, rather than naming anyone specific that I could say, because there's a lot of them. Obviously, we all have the same go-to people. But when I was 14 years old, I went to Cinema Village in New York, which is still around, that used to show double features, the Repertory House. And it was Hills of Eyes and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. What a great double feature. Now, Hills of Eyes is an amazing action movie by Wes Craven, and I was very entertained. I was 14. But then I saw the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and I was just like destroyed. And it wasn't because the movie, I didn't really like it. It was very uncomfortable. I remember my mother being very angry that I'd gone to see it, which was it was hard to rebel at home because my mother, we came from Copenhagen, so she had done the whole liberal, political, leftist kind of movement and photographed all the jazz musicians and had, known Miles Davis and stuff. So how do you rebel at home? Unless something that she hated, which was, American imperialism, violence, horror, Ronald Reagan. So guess what I liked growing up? But that movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, was more my understanding that film could be an art form. That film could be a painting. Film could be a sound. Film could be... Stories didn't have to have a sexuality. Stories didn't have to have a meaning. Stories didn't have to have a reason to exist. It didn't even have a purpose. It had no moral. It was like seeing something completely free. And so you can say, I became a student of that movie. Because that movie, from then on, in everything I've made, I've always thought about that film, that experience of being free in making something. But I also learned that if I work in genre, I can financially survive because that is the only thing that really makes dough. And we're all gonna make some dough to make sure that we can get some more dough. But that film, and I was able to meet Toby Hooper some years ago at the Cannes Film Festival, where there was like, he was brought back to, it was like the 40th anniversary. And I was able to tell Toby, who I'd never met before, that I was like the old school version. I was a student of his film, and that film taught me everything that I wanted to know about art and film. So that would be the one I would probably say.
Did you know that they turned the gas station from the movie into a barbecue joint?
They have?
It's just perfect.
Oh, well.
It's like an hour out of Austin.
Commercialize this and that.
Oh, no. I mean, it leans into the theme.
Oh, of course. Yeah. There's a franchise in the works.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I was curious what it was like collaborating with Hideo Kojima, and if you were a fan of his work before, or if he came to you.
So Hideo wrote me an email about like 15 years ago, and I didn't know who he was because I'm not a gamer. But he came because my Japanese distributor said, "Hey, there's this Japanese dude who wants to get in touch with you. Can I give you a share? Yeah, just have him email me." So he emailed me, to say hello, and I have a cousin who works in gaming and does a game called Hitman, like about a guy who goes around shooting people. And I said, "Oh, do you know this guy Hideo something?" And he's like, and he had a heart attack for like 5 seconds because that was like God's name was brought into his orbit. So then I knew who Hideo was, and so we met in London because he happened to be traveling. I was in Copenhagen, so he asked if I would have dinner. And so we don't speak. I mean, I don't speak Japanese. He doesn't speak English. So we met in London, and there was just something that clicked between us as friends. And we've never had a conversation because we speak through an interpreter or through music and images. So we send things to each other, and that's how we communicate. And then it kind of just grew from there. And we have many similarities. And
he's a big movie buff.
oh, all he talks about is movies. And then he asked me to be in his game, and which he's the creator of. I'm just the eye candy. He's the genius in it. But then I worked with Prada, and I did 2 exhibitions, one in Japan and one here in New York, where I brought him on as kind of my co-creator, you know, because we enjoy each other's company and so forth. But he's great.
Very cool.
So, just because we have building hours, we'll make yours the last question.
I just want to know, how did you consciously decide to become a certain type of artist as a director over other artists, or was it something that was subconscious that you already knew since you were very young that you wanted to be a director?
I never knew I wanted to be a director. And I was unartistic growing up. I didn't paint. The museum was the Antichrist. I was not in any way gifted, on the contrary. I had no skills. There's a line in a movie that I made called Bronson, where he talks about his life, that he can't dance, he can't sing, can't act. So I didn't really have a lot of options. But I wanted to be famous. And it was at a time in New York where fame, the act of fame was the performance piece, you know, in the early 80s when I grew up. So how do I become famous? And obviously you first go to acting school, but then I got kicked out of acting school. So I never knew what I wanted to do. And then suddenly I just had this opportunity to become a director. And obviously I took it. But sometimes you don't know why things happen. But I realized that I want to be in charge, and I want to do it my way. And it can only be done my way. So you have to build an ecosystem where you're allowed to do that, which goes back to, there's 4 ways to survive in the film industry. There is, you make an amazing movie and you make a lot of money. But that's like playing Russian roulette with 6 bullets. Then you can make amazing movies that don't lose money. And you will survive because there's always be some studio or some billionaire from Kazakhstan who's willing to give you money so you can go on the red carpet. I've sold that many times. You know, I've sold executive producer credits. Like, oh, your wife want to go to camp? Oh, absolutely, $40,000. You know, EP credit. Then you can make a terrible movie that makes a lot of money, but no one really cares because it ain't sexy. And then you can make a bad movie that loses money. You do that once. So you have to figure out where do you want to be.
Well, this was such a joy to have you here. Thank you so much for coming. We probably have a few minutes if some people want to come and say hi. If that's okay.
You're going to hold my hand?
Yes, please. We need a full report.
Good. Best of luck to everyone.